This special edition podcast is brought to you by the Pro Bono Institute. PBI is a nonprofit organization that supports, enhances, and helps to transform the pro bono efforts of major law firms, in-house corporate legal departments, and public interest organizations in the U.S. and around the world. Welcome to PBI's podcast, The Challenge of COVID-19 Legal Community in Action, Episode 6. I'm your host, Nihad Mansour, PBI's Assistant Director of the law firm Pro Bono Project. In this episode, PBI interviews Ron Flagg, President of the Legal Services Corporation, to learn more about the LSC eviction study that launched in September 2020. Ron shared some details about the eviction study and why it's important given the coronavirus pandemic and the current state of the eviction crisis across the nation.
Evictions are among the most pressing problems facing America today. And I'll elaborate on this shortly, but Congress directed LSC to conduct an eviction study last year prior to the pandemic. And recent data show that evictions are increasing the spread of COVID-19 and the death rates caused by COVID-19. So legal aid in eviction cases can literally save lives. Now let me take a step back and provide some context for LSC's eviction study. Even before the pandemic, rental housing problems, which often lead to eviction, affected about 1/3 of poor and low-income households. There were over 1 million evictions annually before the pandemic. Evictions have an enormous impact on people and families. And evictions placed on an individual or family's credit record make it much more difficult for such individuals and their families to obtain quality rental housing. Evictions result in poor health outcomes, such as respiratory disease, anxiety, depression, and suicide. Again, with COVID-19, these health effects become even more significant. Eviction causes unemployment and creates barriers to future employment opportunities. Eviction prevents access to social services and community networks. For children who are the dominant population affected by eviction is particularly traumatizing and results in emotional, physical, and academic decline. Now, despite the enormity of these pre-pandemic numbers and the numerous serious consequences befalling families who suffer eviction, surprisingly, at least to me, there exists very few data analyzing any correlation between the substance of state and local laws and procedures, which vary widely across the country and even within states can vary widely. There's very little data showing any correlation between those laws and procedures and the widely disparate eviction rates across the country. So to address the pressing need for more information about the impact of laws and procedures on eviction, Congress directed LSC to conduct a study on the subject of eviction. And they did it in a committee report accompanying the fiscal year 2020 Consolidated Appropriations Act, which was passed actually last year. LSC's eviction study launched in September 2020 and will continue through December 2021. The project is being guided by an external advisory board of legal aid providers, social and legal researchers, court representatives, and housing policy experts whose collective specialized knowledge will help inform our work. In the initial stage of the project, LSC is working with Temple University's Center for Public Health Law Research to create a comprehensive database of eviction laws and procedures for all the U.S. states and territories, and a sample of laws and procedures from counties and municipal jurisdictions from across the country. This database will be used in conjunction with the extensive court records LSC has collected from around the country. Used together, these resources can be used to examine the impact of different policies and procedures and laws on eviction outcomes and the role of legal aid in mitigating.
In addition to producing a report at the completion of the study in September 2021, LSC will be sharing findings throughout the year in different ways.
Well, everybody will have access to results of the study. The barrier civil legal aid faces generally, and certainly this is true in the eviction area, is a lack of public knowledge about the subject matter, and certainly that's one of the things Congress meant to address and that we are going to be addressing. So over the next year, LSC will be sharing updates and findings on our eviction study webpage. We will be making its debut shortly in December. The webpage will feature blogs, data notes, and briefs covering a variety of topics related to eviction. And those materials will be published on a regular basis. For example, briefing topics may include detailed descriptions of differing eviction processes across the United States in different localities, variation in eviction laws at the state and local level, report on evictions in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, maybe cataloging service innovations which seem most successful in addressing evictions, ways of increasing pro bono engagement in eviction legal aid, again, highlighting those pro bono projects that seem to be most impactful. We will, in addition to the website and updating the public in that way, LSC and our housing task force, which is working in conjunction with the eviction study, will hold public hearings over the next year, both to gather additional information for the eviction study and to discuss the implication of the study's ongoing findings to the field of civil legal aid and for public policy. When the study concludes a year from now in December 2021, LSC will publish a comprehensive overview of all our findings in the final report. We will hold rollout events around the country following the study's release to educate decision makers and the public and bar about eviction and related housing issues. This issue is very timely, and I don't want to wait another year for the opportunity to share findings and recommendations. And we urge you and all of our listeners to share the findings and recommendations we broadcast, because again, one of the greatest barriers we face is really public ignorance about these topics.
As we near the close of 2020, Ron noted some significant developments in the eviction crisis since the earlier part of the year.
Again, the eviction crisis was great prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic has greatly magnified the eviction crisis that caused Congress to direct LSC to conduct our eviction study even before the pandemic. Researchers estimate that 30 to 40 million Americans face eviction in the coming months. Again, these numbers sometimes are mind-numbing given the dimensions they're worth repeating. Up to 30 to 40 million Americans may face evictions in the coming months. And let's say those numbers are higher than turn out to be the case, and it's only, say, 10 or 15 million Americans. That would be a disaster of, the highest consequence for the country. Housing displacement result in homelessness and overcrowded living environments, which can increase the spread of coronavirus. So it's really a double whammy. People are not only losing their homes, which is a disaster under any circumstances, but it's for the people being displaced and the rest of us in a public health disaster as well. So let me be clear about the consequences of the eviction crisis. Data show that evictions increase the spread of COVID-19 and the death rates caused by COVID-19. Makes perfect sense. Families evicted from their homes are forced to squeeze into housing spaces with relatives and friends or in homeless shelter. Exactly what you don't want during a pandemic, particularly during the winter months when people are forced to stay indoors more than the warmer months. The major issues right now are that millions of Americans have lost their jobs and as a result cannot pay their rent. Many landlords can't pay their mortgages when their tenants are unable to pay their rent. Much of the financial support provided earlier in the pandemic has expired, and the various state and local eviction moratoriums have expired. Now, the partial eviction moratorium the Centers for Disease Control imposed to stem the public health crisis is set to expire on December 31st. Obviously, that public health crisis continues, but at least currently, the CDC moratorium is set to expire on December 31st, in the middle of winter, and just as the coronavirus infection rates are spiking. A study just released examined the effects of lifting the eviction moratorium on COVID-19 infection and mortality rates. That study showed that after controlling for stay-at-home orders, mask orders, school closures, testing rates, and state characteristics, the study found that lifting eviction moratoriums amounted to 433,700 excess cases and 10,700 excess deaths across 27 states during the study period, which was March 1st to September 3rd of this year. Very recent data. Just to give you an example, the study showed there were 4,456 excess deaths in Texas and 959 excess deaths in Louisiana alone. With the CDC moratorium set to expire on December 31st, the situation we face with regard to eviction is dire.
Ron shared how LSC grantees across the nation are preparing for this tsunami of evictions.
Well, sort of hopes and prayers, but they're taking concrete steps beyond that. LSC grantees and other legal aid organizations have been attempting to direct additional staff resources and pro bono resources to work on eviction cases. They obviously have shortages of resources in other areas, family law, domestic violence, unemployment cases, health cases, all of which are also seeing surges. But the surge of evictions that seem likely to occur mean many more resources are needed, and certainly our grantees are scrambling to find other resources. LSC received $50 million in CARES Act funding back in March, which we immediately granted out. We are hopeful that Congress will appropriate at least an additional $100 million in supplemental funding for LSC to help address the general legal aid crisis that has been aggravated by the pandemic, with, again, certainly a large portion of that falling within the eviction category.
If you'd like to support the eviction study and LSC grantees to prepare for and meet this eviction emergency, there are many ways to get involved.
This really is a moment of severe crisis, not for the legal community, but for our neighbors who are threatened with eviction in staggering numbers, and for our neighbors who, and the rest of us, whose health will be threatened as a result of this surge in eviction. To meet this emergency, we really need all hands on deck. So I urge all members of the body, regardless of their specialty, to volunteer with legal aid organizations serving your community to help address this emergency. I know the bar associations, PBI, and other organizations in many communities are helping to organize efforts to provide pro bono assistance. Certainly, the need has never been greater. as I've said a couple times before, but I think it just bears repeating because people are not aware of it. Evictions increase the spread of COVID-19 and the death rates caused by COVID-19. Legal aid in eviction cases can literally save lives. Anybody who's listening to this can contribute some time to help stem the tide of eviction should do it. You'll be saving lives. LSC's eviction study will be shining a spotlight on the eviction crisis, and potential changes in laws and procedures, innovations in legal services and pro bono that can help address this crisis. I hope everyone listening to the podcast will spread the word about the eviction crisis, the eviction study's findings and recommendations, and the steps we can all take to help address this emergency now. Well, I just want to thank the Pro Bono Institute for helping LSC to shine a spotlight on the critical issue of evictions and to help mobilize the bar across the country to volunteer, to provide pro bono volunteers. They've never been more urgently needed. It's a matter of life and death.
Since our conversation with Ron, the Senate leadership announced a bipartisan deal on an approximately $900 billion economic relief package that includes $25 billion in emergency assistance to renters and extends the moratorium on evictions that was set to expire at the end of this year until January 31st. Additionally, Congress is expected to pass legislation that will appropriate $465 million for LSC, resulting in the largest appropriation in actual dollars in LSC's history. While this news is a major relief, the challenges that Ron discussed still remain. Thank you to Ron Flagg for his thoughtful remarks and leadership on the coronavirus pandemic and the state of evictions in this country. You can follow the eviction study and access blogs and updates at lsc.gov. Developments in the coronavirus are moving fast, but the legal community is adapting to move with it. Please watch for more COVID-19 focused episodes as we continue to shine light on the legal sector's response to this evolving crisis. We also hope that, if you're not already doing so, you will join with those already taking action. More resources on how to help are available at www.probonoinst.org. Thanks for listening, stay safe, and be well.